Cool, scaling. And so most of the fame that scaling gets is being kind of dominated by the startup movement, or the whole startup thing, where if you're not going from 0 to 100 million in 5 minutes, somehow you're not scaling. And that's not necessarily true, because there's also a lot of survivorship bias with internet type startup companies, where you only hear about the ones that went from 0 to 100 million, while majority or 99% of them actually die. So I want to talk more about a more realistic perspective of scaling, and that's what today's my presentation is going to be about. All right, so this is results from a business that I worked in, where the scaling here is not profit driven or even revenue driven, but in return on investment driven. Because if you just scale just on revenue, it's actually very easy to scale revenue, start selling things at a loss. So if you, and I've had that where I've walked into the business, they're like, well, we grew so much. Like, what does the P&L look like? And it's just all red. Like, well, it's not very sustainable. So the one that I want to focus on, at least for the purpose of today's presentation, is the scale that you get from a return on investment. And to scale this is far more profitable, actually, because that's getting 50% ROI on your money. Right, so what is scaling? Firstly, it's not marketing scaling, right? So scaling that you get when you scale the entire business. A lot of focus has been given on scaling that is from the marketing standpoint is, you know what, we bought X amount of traffic, and unfortunately that's not the scaling we're talking about here. The scaling we're going to talk about is how do you scale the entire business, which is why you're working with systems, because systems allow you to scale the whole business. All right, because of our emphasis on the long term, we make decisions and weigh trade-offs. That's from Jeff Bezos. This is the very first letter he sent to his shareholders back in 1997, where he kind of shares his philosophy about what Amazon is actually going to do. And what I found quite interesting is that firstly he's telling people who want short-term gains not to invest. So he's doing some market segmentation there with his own shareholders. But more importantly, scaling is actually an investment decision. And that's the focus that I'm going to have on today's presentation. It's the two components of scaling, at least from my experience. The number one is the opportunity identification and investment. What are you going to scale? What are you not going to scale? And when you're going to scale? I think they are far more important decisions to make than the recipe part of scaling, which is where most of the focus on scaling has been. Here's my 10-step process to scale. Unfortunately, if you scale the wrong thing, you'll go broke. So we'll talk further about that throughout this presentation, but just want to share with you that the first thing, which is what are you going to invest in, what are you going to scale, or when you're going to scale, is much more important. Right. So what isn't opportunity identification and investment? I think we just covered that. All right. So let's go through an issue that you can have with scaling. So in this case, Elon Musk does not have issues with marketing as a scaling exercise. I think he's got back orders till 2055. Unfortunately, he just can't make enough cars. So even though you have one of the world's greatest thinkers or visionaries, they can't produce cars to fulfill the demand that's already there actually, because they already pre-sold all this, or at least sold certificates to go buy the cars, and they can't fulfill the demand. So while he's talking about boring company and putting people on Mars, this challenge of being able to produce more cars has been a big issue for their business. Right. So what is not scaling? Once again, the marketing part, and where you want to not just focus on the most obvious thing to scale. So you may walk into a business and say, you know what, if we just get more leads, I'll get a bigger business. Unfortunately, if you do that, you will break your business. And we'll look at that in a second. All right, so the relationship between scaling and systemization. So we've spoken a lot about systemization today. To me, systemization, which is getting things in order, making people walk in one direction is what systemization is. And what that does, that gives you a call option or an option on scaling. So it's almost, because it's very difficult to scale without systemization. Because the minute you start driving, it's almost like building a house and having plumbing that where the pipes are actually quite thin, and all of a sudden you want to put a fire hydrant onto it, you'll actually flood the house. So it's something similar to that, where you need to make sure that systemization, which is the plumbing, allows you to put more throughput through the whole system. And that's why systemization is a prerequisite for scaling. Right, so simple test is if you acquired double, triple, or 10 or even 100 times more customers, what would break? And that's probably the most important question to ask, or is a more important one, which is, why do you want to scale? So recently a friend of ours posted something on where he said that one of the worst advice he's ever received is you should scale. And so, this was my reply to that, is that scaling, in my experience, is the consequence of stumbling onto an opportunity that is scalable and not something that happens from an upfront plan. And I've found this with every business I've scaled, or every project I've worked on where we've scaled really heavy, really fast, is it was rarely ever boardroom style. You know, one day we sat down in a coffee shop, we came up with the idea, and we said, this is how we're going to scale it. The reality is, the minute you start doing something, you'll realize that your idea was actually quite dumb. And that's normally how it happens. So what you want to do is you want to wait till you get lucky, and you scale that, all right? Because it's going to be very difficult to work out a priori what's going to be scalable. All right. This is what happens when you go from PowerPoint to Keynote. It stuffs up your arrows. All right, so basically what I wanted to show here is should you be systemizing or scaling? I think too many people are focusing on scaling too soon. But so I'll just share how to go about doing how to go about doing that. Okay, let's see if I can explain this without the arrows properly. Okay, so have you achieved problem solution fit? So you've got you're solving a reasonably good problem. If you're not, that should say back to the drawing board. And if you have, then you go down to have you achieved the product market fit? And if you have, then you go, can you disappear for 90 days? That should say, can you disappear for 90 days? And the answer is that if you can disappear for 90 days, then you're probably okay to scale. Once again, it's a heuristic. Okay? It's not an absolute law or rule. It's a way of thinking about this. And so if you can disappear for 90 days, then and your business doesn't die or go down, it continues to run as is, or if you've had growth plans, it continues to grow as you planned. If that's not the case, then you want to focus on the systemization part of the business, which is because we're not ready yet. And by disappear, I really mean disappear, like off of the grid and see what happens. I don't do that unless you're systemized. Right, so why is this so important? Because according to a study of about 3,200 high-growth internet startups, 70% of them died because they scaled prematurely. So that, I think, is one of the biggest issues I've seen in guys that I've tried to work with on projects where we're scaling, is they're in such a rush that they actually kill themselves. Because being able to do this, you need to have your cash flow down pat. There's a lot of other pieces of the puzzle have to be in order for this to happen at scale. All right, so scaling starts with you. So this is a heuristic or diagram that I use within my business. The more foundational, the more important ones are right at the bottom. And if you can see, revenue generation is right at the top. For me, revenue generation is a consequence of getting everything else right. Because if we don't get all of this stuff right, there is going to be no revenue. Or if it is, it's going to be sporadic, it's going to be erratic, it's going to be hard work. So the first one is personal, which is your making sure that your own personal psychology is down pat. You know, your mindset's in the right place. You're not a raving lunatic to work with. And then comes the optionality part, which is being able to realize that the game of business is about making micro investments and seeing where the payoffs happen. It's a portfolio manager. It's like an investment manager, where you're you're making sure that, because it's going to be difficult to work out beforehand what's going to be successful, so you make little bets all over the place and seeing where the payoffs are. And then you double down after that. Okay, then comes the people and culture part, because without the ability to, and I think Melissa drove the point home really well, that without the people part, really nothing else is going to matter. Because unless you've designing an AI machine, there are going to be no humans involved. Outside of that scenario, your ability to work with people is actually probably most important apart from your own thinking. Then comes the systemization or systemology part of the whole thing, which is making sure your systems, processes, automation technology is there to support your customer fulfillment. And then lastly, if you do that, then your revenue generation comes in.